I'm Maria Goretti Karhanga, Board Chairperson for Human Rights Research Documentation Center, Huric. I'm a chairperson of the 5 persons committee. And our focus and our niche, we advocate for better health services for people in need. And our niche is for those who really can't speak for themselves. And we get the advocacy issues for health, improved health services from the research we conduct with grassroots. When we conduct participatory research, we get people's views on how best health issues could be best handled in their locations.
My name is Dennis Joseph Kenya, the Executive Director of Human Rights Research Documentation Center, Huric. So we have had this very interesting project that we are implementing in Kakoma and the countrywide about demystifying infodemics in the country. Or in other words, we call it managing infodemics about COVID-19 in the country. So how did this idea all start about managing infodemics in Uganda today? So it all started at that time when the pandemic was at the peak or at its peak. We had many challenges, most importantly, the challenges arising from the misinformation coming out of the communities, where you get people saying this, that, the other.
But there could be also some suspicion, a lot of things, I think silly things were said about the vaccines, that they are meant to make us not produce things of that nature.
Rumors abagamba yaba expired simanya health centers zina fridges terekere dagala fridge terekere dagala into kwanje sangibwanga mulago.
And as if that's not enough, the health system was already battered and being battered more, and it was at its most vulnerable. I have seen it in years I have been alive.
Medicines for COVID, especially the ones that were specifically advocated for COVID management, were being sold very expensively on the open market, and even the ones that were being given out in the public sector were quite limited, so they were not enough.
The situation is dire. We are officially having what we would refer to as a second COVID wave. So we are admitting lots of patients who are critically ill. First of all, there's the rate of number of cases that we are registering per day is going higher and higher. I think.
So we had a meeting with the board. Right. Of course, as an institution, Huric was constrained, so we had to agree on so many things. Most of which was how do we maintain our resource persons.
So when COVID ravaged the whole world, and in particular Uganda, we at the Huric Center, we thought of our communities, our partners, what is happening to them if they are not moving. In case they get sick, where do they get health services? That's when the board made a resolution that despite being locked down, because definitely with lockdown, some people could move under special arrangements. So the board made a resolution that we should know how people are managing.
What we saw is that the infodemics coming into these rural poor communities really did more harm than good. They dilapidated homes, the health system itself. We need to first of all promote and sensitize masses about these infodemics. The issue of the cold chain, how the vaccines are concerned. We needed to do something about the cold chain for basically Kakoma, because Kakoma is one of the centers that receives a number of people. We need to do something about the cold chain and probably give them refrigeration cases and stuff like that. We also need to create a hotline which would help us to get more information about the issue of the pandemic, especially the infodemics. So people can always call in to our call center and then talk about what information they need to get about COVID-19 or any other pandemic. And we can become a resource center to give them that information. And of course, do a bit of documentation on what these communities have as a falsehood where vaccines are concerned. So another way forward is the issue of documenting further the health rights injustices under the pandemic, and probably those that were caused by the infodemics. Now, what happens is that we cannot have an experience and don't document it. What happens if we get into another pandemic? So with this documenting perspective, it will help us to better prepare for the next pandemic. You know, we have always had Ebola here, and we did a good job on Ebola. But there's nothing about Ebola that was reflected. There's nothing about Ebola that was deflected in the way we handled this pandemic. So I think now we need to really do a lot of documentation, and Huric would do a good job along those lines, documenting the injustices and the falsehoods that caused the challenges. The other issue that I would want to talk about is the issue of creating more participatory approaches in community. So our advocacy should be more participatory. So participatory in a manner that we kind of work with people to promote them participating when pandemics are concerned. So that now the people can be the voice to demand that when we have a pandemic, what should we do? So then the laws will easily come into place. That kind of could create a guideline on how a pandemic should be handled. And now this takes me back to the public health laws. The public health laws we had were a cake, and I think they were last amended in 1939. And now the government has done a bit of amendment on them, but I think it's a rush amendment. So we should go back and look at these laws that look at the pandemic and kind of work with the people. That is why I'm thinking we should promote more participation. And for us, we call it participatory action research. That now can tell us how best we can get people involved in these laws that protect them. We need to do more media coverage, because right now we are having challenges with how people are responding to people thinking that the pandemic ended because the economy was opened up. So these rural communities again have challenges. For instance, now this in Kakoma, it is a border community. So we have many people coming from Tanzania, going to Tanzania and all that. But people believe that the pandemic ended. I think the pandemic is still with us, and people need to remain cautious, and they need to remain following SOPs. And then also we have one very interesting issue where we had maternity ward being turned into quarantine center. That means the maternity ward was displaced. We do not need to lose this alternative of people having to use maternal services at the Kakoma Health Center. We need to do something about supporting them to expand the maternal center so that now it can accommodate the numbers they have. So in that time, as we concluded that, the board actually asked us that it is rather important that we make our contribution towards the nation in terms of how the health system was impacted or is being impacted by COVID-19. So the team already set to work, and we did a bit of research, that is desk research mostly, in finding out what really was impacting negatively on the health system and what could be done in terms of our advocacy to help and bring information to the floor, to the bear, and do awareness raising on issues of the pandemic. In our simple way of contribution. It was very interesting that we realized that the biggest challenge we were having at that time was the issue of information flow. And false information has a way of traveling fast. So false information was actually impacting the already battered and vulnerable system more than any other effect that we as Huric established. And therefore we sat to work and wrote to many potential donors about a bit of support for us to be able to go out in communities and raise awareness or do something about the misinformation or manage the infodemics that are actually coming out, because you can't know what is wrong and what is right. So then we were supported by Stichting Foundation, who gave us a bit of support, And that is where we started rolling out a project on managing infodemics. And the time when we started out, it was more about the misinformation that was being peddled by people on social media and other platforms. But then now it became bigger. When the vaccines came into the picture, now people were being challenged by who to believe, whether to access the vaccines or actually to shun the vaccines. Because many were saying it is a ploy from Europe to kill the multitude in Africa, the multitudes in Africa, or to reduce the population in Africa. And as a matter of fact, the people who managed to get the vaccination were also having what we call side effects. And the side effects were not making it any easier on others who were hearing from them. There was an issue of erectile dysfunction. There was an issue of actually people passing on from taking the vaccine, probably from the explanations we get today, because they took the vaccine when they actually had the COVID-19, they had COVID. And then we also had an issue of people or the health workers who are working in these health facilities being discriminated upon in their communities because people thought that they were the source of COVID.
One of the other challenges was also access to personal protective gear for the health workers, and that was both private and the public sector.
And even the homes that had victims or people who died in homes, different homes that had patients who passed on or those who didn't even pass on, it became very unbearable for the children going to socialize with others in those communities. Managing Infodemics' perspective was basically to get to these communities and talk to them about the importance of accessing the only solution we have so far in dealing with COVID-19. Yeah? So then we went to these communities, and the information coming out of these communities, that was a deterrent towards them accessing the vaccine, was very interesting. It was hard enough for the government to access these vaccines because of how expensive they were, how inaccessible they were, and how hoarded they were by those companies, many companies that were, manufacturing them. So we found that even the few that we had instances of them expiring, to an extent that the government had to come out and make bylaws and actually make penal laws of people not accessing these vaccines. So at the end of the day, you found that our engagement with the communities, mostly in the Kakoma community, kind of helped because the uptake of these vaccines became interestingly improved. And actually now we had the challenges of the cold chain because the cold chain was insufficient. People would sit a whole day at an access point and probably not get vaccinated.
Naye nze nafuna kadoozi kamu kaali ka AstraZeneca lwe nadda ngunfune akokubiri ne batugamba ngu tekaaliwo ngu tugende ku ddwaliro.
When the issue of cards came in, there was a challenge of you having, basically, first of all, having a national ID to be able to access a vaccine. And then when we talked and kept doing advocacy around this, the government removed that. With any identification, you'd get immunized. And of course, the challenges that were catastrophic in terms of human rights, where people were being forced out of cars to get vaccinated at roadsides, also was not the best picture that was painted in this time of the pandemic. So managing Infodemics, as you hear in the community where we shall be, the most information coming out, and what we have been doing with these communities to try and bring out the picture of what it should be in terms of accessing the vaccines and the importance of people in these communities accessing vaccines if they are available. And also, of course, speaking to the powers that be, that we need more vaccines to our people. I thank you, and I wish you good luck.